do is they build up walls upon walls upon walls. Like when some of my patients, when I ran a residential treatment program for people with really serious PTSD, soldiers who had really were in really bad shape, and one of them described it as they had walls upon walls upon walls and a very small keyhole, right? A very small keyhole. And they pushed away everybody in their lives. So really, early intervention is probably the best solution in terms of whether you have debriefings, having groups where people can talk about what happened and actually process it. Because what happens in PTSD is you don't have a place to put the information. Go ahead.
Do you need a professional to lead those groups?
It's an interesting question. So, I don't know if you've ever been in a firehouse. Have you ever been in a firehouse?
As a kid and bringing my kids.
Okay, because in the firehouse, I don't know if you noticed this, they have kitchens in the firehouse. And they stay there. And they cook together. In a good firehouse, they cook together and they talk together. So I recently had a firehouse where there was a fatality of one of the lieutenants. He was a 20-year veteran in the fire department. They were in a fire in a garage. There was a lot of things. There was a lot of chaos around the fire, and they were in a garage, and the garage roof collapsed. 3 firefighters were injured. 1 was killed. The lieutenant. 1 was seriously burned. And so when I got to the firehouse where he worked to do a debriefing, the lieutenant in charge looked at me and said, "We're going to do this around the table." Like, now I usually do it in another room with a circle so that there's no barriers. But he said, "We solve our problems around the table." And he was very emphatic about it. So I'm not going to fight with the lieutenant about this because it doesn't make any sense. But he was brilliant. I mean, he was really, really brilliant because he actually was able to talk about his own experiences in dealing with these situations, and he was very open about it. So it really was very helpful. But so in answer to your question, does there need to be a professional? Sometimes people work these things out themselves, but it depends on the group. And it also depends on what's happening. What's happening here for all of us who've gone less than a week, right? This is like a fresh wound, right? Right? Fresh wounds don't heal right away, do they?
Yeah, they take a different,
They take a different path, right? I mean, you have somebody who has, just my own experience, last year in July I had open heart surgery, and they told me that after open heart surgery, a lot of times people get very emotional. And I was like, well, I mean, I was anxious before it. I'm sitting in the hospital room, and I don't know how many times I asked for a chaplain to come by. Well, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th day, the chaplain walks in, Jewish chaplain, and he brings me a Shabbos box, and we're talking, and I just break down into tears. I mean, literally, I couldn't stop crying. I didn't understand it. It was like, how did this happen? You have to process what you go through. If you don't process it, you're not going to find a place for it. So the way, I may not have the medical stuff here 100%, but we have brains, and in our brains we have filing cabinets. That's the way I think about it. We file stuff away. You don't have to think of, everybody here drive a car? Now you're working with your son who's new at driving a car. Does he have to think about it when he gets into the car? He has to think about like exactly where the mirrors are. It takes a little while, right? How to step on the gas. The first time you start doing that, it's not something you're used to doing, right? A year after you've learned how to drive, You don't think about that stuff anymore because it's all programmed in your brain in a way that's, now let's say, and I use this loosely, let's say you had a stroke or something like that, and it affected that area of the brain that you know how to drive from. You'd have to relearn how to drive. You'd have to relearn certain behaviors because a piece of where your file stuff, it gets damaged. Now, when you have PTSD, you don't have a filing space for the event. So you want to go out to the restaurant with your significant other, and you're going to really, really try this time. And as soon as you get into the car, you start thinking about the event. And you get to the restaurant and you see that there's no tables where you can't sit and look at the door. Because, like, you know, people who are hypervigilant, they have to look at the door because they want to see who's coming in and out, right? That's hypervigilance, right? They don't, I always say to them, well, you know, the kitchen has a lot of knives. Right? Right? Just in general, you know, there's plenty of danger in the world. You know, this is what is hard for people to really understand. When you're anxious and you think everything is a risk, then nothing becomes safe, and nothing becomes safe. That's problematic because you're robbing yourself of life when you do that. And so I encourage people to recognize that there's a certain amount of risk in everything that we do. When we wake up in the morning, when we get into a car, right? I am constantly amazed at how vulnerable I feel in a car in Israel. In fact, today when I was driving to Netanya, and I realized that there were a lot of cars on the road, and they all seem to be driving much faster than they usually drive. I mean, there were some people who were driving like really maniacs. I mean, more so than maybe because there wasn't as much traffic. But I feel tremendously vulnerable. Now, if I let that vulnerable feeling get to me, I wouldn't drive in Israel. Right? I wouldn't drive in Israel if I let that vulnerability get to me. So the point really is that we have to measure risk. We have to measure risk with reward. And when you have PTSD, that equation starts to fail. You start to lose perspective on the fact that we do dangerous things all the time, right? You cross. I hate to bring up Israel again, but you cross the street in a crosswalk here, you're taking your life in your hands, because you never know if that car is going to stop when you're in that crosswalk. I mean, I've almost hit people doing that. I mean, you just don't know. If you don't make eye contact with the person who's crossing, you can forget that you need to stop.
How long after those events do you bring everyone together?
Usually a few days afterwards. Now, we do several different kinds of events. The first one is we do a diffusing. Sometimes, so I was talking about the lieutenant who got killed. What we did was I went to the firehouse that day, and I just made myself available. Someone brought some pizza, and we just sit down and we talk about the person and just allow people to kind of, because they're too vulnerable at the time. The numbness, right? How many of you still feel numb from what the events of Saturday? I mean, have any of you process? I mean, just sheer process the level of trauma that we've all experienced this week. It's hard, and it's going to be harder. You think about your children who are on the front lines, who are having to go into some of these houses and deal with what they have to deal with. They're going to be permanently changed as a result of it. That doesn't mean permanently disabled as a result of it, but it does mean that it's going to impact their lives in a way that we can't even imagine. And so we have to, first of all, we have to as much as we can, give them an opportunity to talk about, and they won't want to talk about it. They'll want to protect